Imagine coming home after a long day, expecting the comfort of familiarity, only to find a single receipt that shatters everything you believed in. A luxurious hotel suite, a name that isn't yours, and the undeniable proof of betrayal. But what if, instead of confrontation, you chose something far more devastating? This isn't just a story of revenge, it's a masterclass in calculated destruction. Stay with me, because this is only the beginning. The school bell rang, marking the end of another day. Eric Dawson gathered his notes, offering a polite nod to the last few students filtering out of his high school English classroom. 20 years in education had given him a sense of structure, predictability that, until recently, had felt reassuring. Lately, however, that structure had become a crutch, something to hold on to while the rest of his world quietly slipped out of his grasp. The drive home followed the same well-worn path. The familiar turns, the same houses, the unchanged scenery. It should have been comforting. But when his own home came into view, the feeling that settled in his chest was not one of relief. Once, that modest two-story house had been filled with warmth. Now, it felt like a carefully maintained shell. A structure that had outlived the love that once made it a home. Stepping inside, he was met with silence. A single glance at the counter told him what he already suspected: Laura was home. Her purse rested exactly where she always left it. She was probably upstairs, wrapped up in her own world, a world that seemed to move further away from his with each passing day. Eric loosened his tie, heading toward the kitchen for a drink, hoping to quiet the unease that had been gnawing at him for months. That's when he saw it. A small slip of paper, barely noticeable, peeking from her purse. A receipt. Normally, he wouldn't have given it a second thought, but something, a whisper of intuition, made him reach for it. He smoothed out the paper, and as his eyes scanned the words printed on it, his grip tightened. A reservation. A luxury suite. The Maplewood Grand Hotel. And the name on the receipt, Ethan Mercer. Eric read the name again, the weight of realization pressing down on him. Ethan, a name he had heard before. A name that had surfaced in passing conversations. A name that belonged to the architect Laura had been working with on a recent project. He had noticed her excitement when she spoke about him. The way her expression had shifted, the subtle inflection in her voice. He had dismissed it, convinced himself that it was nothing. Now, the proof was in his hands. The front door opened, breaking the silence. Laura's voice carried through the house, her tone light, as if the ground beneath their marriage had not just cracked open. The sound of her heels clicking against the hardwood floor filled the space, a familiar rhythm that suddenly felt foreign. Eric turned as she entered the kitchen, the receipt held loosely between his fingers. Their eyes met, and for a brief moment, something flickered in her expression. A hesitation. Then, just as quickly, she masked it, straightening with effortless control. She glanced at the slip of paper. No denial, no immediate excuse. Just a brief pause before indifference settled over her like a well-worn coat. Words were exchanged, but none of them softened the truth. She did not beg for understanding. She did not attempt to explain. She simply confirmed what the receipt had already told him. She had outgrown their life together. She had found someone who made her feel something new, something exciting. As she spoke, each sentence landed with quiet precision, each one unraveling years of shared memories and unspoken promises. She had been waiting for this moment, rehearsing it in her mind long before he had discovered the truth. Eric listened, unmoving. The weight of her words settled in, dull at first, then sharp. He thought of the late nights, the secretive phone calls, the growing distance between them. The moments that should have raised alarms but had instead been brushed aside in favor of denial. She had already made her choice. She was simply waiting for him to catch up. Then, as if the conversation had been nothing more than an inconvenient formality, she turned to leave. The silence left in her wake was deafening. For a long time, Eric remained where he stood, staring at the space she had just occupied. The receipt was still clenched in his hand, the crumpled paper now damp with sweat. Shock faded into something else. A cold, steady realization. She believed she had won. She believed that, like always, he would be the one left behind, the one who accepted, the one who endured. But she was wrong. Laura had shattered the life they built together without a second thought. Now, it was his turn. And she would soon learn that he was not the man she had assumed him to be. The morning air was crisp as Eric Dawson sat in his car outside the bank, his fingers drumming against the steering wheel. A sleepless night had done little to dull the sharp edge of realization that had settled in his mind. His marriage had been an illusion, carefully maintained by someone who had long since outgrown it. There was no point in anger, only action. As soon as the bank doors opened, he stepped inside with a quiet determination. Within minutes, he made the necessary changes. The joint account that had once represented trust between them was dissolved. Her credit cards, linked to his name, were cancelled in a few swift keystrokes. What had been a shared foundation was now entirely his. By the time he walked out, the first stage was complete. Laura had chosen to leave their life behind. She would now feel the weight of that decision. The next stop was a lawyer's office, an unremarkable building tucked between towering corporate firms. A favor called in ensured that the divorce papers were drawn up within hours. No drawn-out discussions, no negotiations, just a simple signature separating the past from the future. The process was as cold as the realization that had led him here. Back at the house, he moved with quiet efficiency, taking only what was necessary: clothes, personal documents, and the few possessions that held real meaning. His woodworking tools, the one constant source of clarity in his life, were packed into the trunk of his car. As he passed the living room, his gaze settled on a framed wedding photo. The image of two people smiling, unaware of what lay ahead, felt like a relic of another life. He removed the photograph from its frame and placed it face down on the kitchen table, right next to the divorce papers. A final touch, a handwritten note, brief and deliberate. No explanations. No emotion. Just closure. By the time Laura returned home, Eric was already gone. A motel on the outskirts of town became a temporary refuge, a vantage point from which to observe the fallout. His phone, left on silent, vibrated repeatedly as missed calls and voicemails accumulated. He ignored them all. As the hours passed, curiosity took hold. The first voicemail was frantic. The bank accounts were empty. The cards weren't working. She demanded answers. The next message was angrier, full of threats and accusations, a desperate attempt to regain control over a situation that had already slipped beyond her reach. The final message was different. Ethan Mercer. His voice was calm, his words carefully measured, urging for civility, for reason. Eric let the message play, unimpressed. The man who had quietly replaced him in his wife's life now wanted fairness. The hypocrisy was almost amusing. All numbers were blocked without hesitation. The cracks in Laura's world did not take long to form. A carefully placed comment over coffee with an old acquaintance led to concerned whispers. Her stress, her recent struggles, the weight of her choices, a story designed to shape perception without ever being directly spoken. A passing remark at work found its way into the right conversation. An architect with a reputation for getting too close to his clients. A man known for professional relationships that often blurred into something else. The words took on a life of their own. Eric had always been an observer. Now, he simply directed what had already been inevitable. A few days later, a routine stop at the grocery store placed them in the same space. Laura moved through the aisles differently than before. There was no confidence in her steps, no quiet self-assurance. The carefully curated image she had maintained was beginning to fray. The expensive grocery selections had been replaced with budget options, the polished elegance now dulled by something more strained. The moment she saw him, she approached. Her expression carried the weight of frustration, of confusion. The words that followed were sharp, accusations of manipulation, of sabotage, of whispers turning people against her. She had begun to feel the consequences, though she hadn't yet realized their full extent. Eric met her gaze unaffected. The damage had already begun. Without another word, he walked past her, leaving her standing alone in the aisle. She had assumed she could leave without consequence. Now, she was starting to understand just how wrong she had been. Days passed, and the slow unraveling of Laura Dawson's world continued. Eric watched from a distance, never interfering directly, but ensuring that the consequences of her actions reached her in ways she had never anticipated. The social circles she had carefully cultivated began to shift. Friends who once admired her charm and composure now hesitated, whispers of uncertainty following wherever she went. They sensed something was off but couldn't quite pinpoint what. It wasn't an outright scandal, just a growing discomfort, a quiet unease that made them second-guess the woman they had once trusted. It had started with subtle conversations. A passing concern about her behavior, her recent decisions, her impulsiveness. Words spoken in confidence found their way through different channels, shaping perceptions before she even realized what was happening. At the same time, Ethan Mercer's reputation took a similar hit. Clients began reconsidering their projects, citing vague concerns about his professionalism. It was never direct, just a doubt planted in the right place, a hesitation strong enough to make people question whether they wanted to work with him. Eric had known it wouldn't take much. A man like Ethan thrived on an image of credibility and success. Once that image was compromised, it would take on a life of its own. Laura tried to maintain control. She reached out to the few friends who still responded, weaving stories that painted herself as the victim. Eric was vengeful, bitter, unwilling to move on. She spoke with conviction, but the reactions were not what she had hoped for. Some nodded politely but distanced themselves. Others, who had once admired her ambition, began to question whether she had ever been the person she pretended to be. When the invitations stopped coming, when the texts slowed, when her carefully curated world no longer welcomed her with open arms, she began to realize that something had shifted beyond her control. Ethan's frustration grew as well. His business, once steady, started to decline. Potential clients hesitated, their trust eroded by whispers of unprofessional behavior. He hadn't changed, but his reputation had. And in his world, that was all that mattered. Eric continued on as if nothing had changed. He went to work, maintained his routine, and kept to himself. People viewed him differently now, not with pity, but with respect. He had not lashed out publicly. He had not sought to air grievances or demand justice. He had simply moved forward, while the ones who had wronged him struggled to hold on to what remained of their lives. One afternoon, as he left work, he overheard two colleagues discussing a recent development in town. Ethan had lost a major contract. The details were unclear, but the general sentiment was that his credibility had been damaged beyond repair. Eric didn't react, didn't acknowledge what he already knew to be true. He simply walked past, letting the conversation fade into the background. Later that evening, as he passed a familiar cafe, he caught sight of Laura sitting alone. Her usual confidence was missing. Her posture was tense, her fingers tapping anxiously against the side of her coffee cup. The exhaustion in her expression was unmistakable. For the first time in weeks, she looked like someone who had lost control. Eric didn't stop. He didn't acknowledge her presence. She had made her choices, and now she was forced to live with them. There was nothing left to say. The image she had built was collapsing, piece by piece. And Eric had only just begun to watch it fall. The cracks in Laura Dawson's world had deepened into fractures. Friends had grown distant, her social standing had weakened, and Ethan Mercer's once thriving reputation had begun to crumble. The carefully curated image she had spent years constructing was slipping through her fingers, and for the first time, she found herself on the outside looking in. But people like Laura didn't accept defeat easily. She needed someone to blame, and there was only one person who fit that role, Eric. The first sign of her retaliation came through whispers at work. Colleagues who had once shown sympathy became cautious, their conversations shifting the moment he entered the room. There was something in their expressions, hesitation, mild discomfort, as if they had heard something they weren't sure they believed but still couldn't ignore. Eric wasn't surprised. Laura had always known how to manipulate perception. If she couldn't undo what had been done, she could at least try to rewrite the narrative. It wasn't long before the rumors found their way to the school administration. One morning, he was called into the principal's office. The atmosphere was polite but tense, the kind of carefully neutral tone reserved for delicate matters. Concerns had been raised, the principal explained. Allegations about his behavior, about his treatment of students and staff. Nothing specific, just enough to raise questions. Eric listened without reacting. This was calculated. It wasn't about destroying his career outright, it was about placing a shadow of doubt over him, making people question things they hadn't before. But Laura had underestimated him. A few days later, an unexpected visitor knocked on his door, Marshall Hayes, a veteran teacher he had worked with for years. Unlike the others, Marshall wasn't one to be easily swayed by rumors. He hesitated for only a moment before revealing what he had learned. A younger teacher, Jared Lawson, had been involved in spreading the accusations. Marshall had overheard a conversation. Jared hadn't done it willingly. He had been pressured, manipulated. The conversation had been recorded. Eric listened to the audio file, recognizing Jared's voice immediately. The hesitation, the uncertainty, the fear. The confession was clear. He had been coerced into participating. And though the person pulling the strings was never explicitly named, the implication was obvious. Laura had orchestrated the entire thing. Armed with evidence, Eric took a different approach. He didn't lash out, didn't confront her directly. Instead, he set the truth in motion. The recording was presented to the school board. The fabricated nature of the accusations became clear, and the case against him dissolved before it could gain real traction. The attempted sabotage had failed. But more importantly, Laura had exposed herself. What had once been whispers against Eric turned into whispers about her. If she was willing to manipulate a colleague, what else was she capable of? The shift was subtle at first. Conversations that had once ended when she entered a room began to continue in hushed tones. The looks of concern that had been directed at Eric were now turned toward her. She had tried to ruin him. Instead, she had only accelerated her own downfall. With her plan exposed, Laura Dawson's world began unraveling at a pace she could no longer control. What had started as subtle distancing from friends and acquaintances quickly turned into open avoidance. The whispers, once focused on Eric, had now shifted entirely to her. She had spent years constructing a life built on perception, carefully curating an image of success and influence. Now, that image was crumbling. At the same time, Ethan Mercer's professional downfall was nearing completion. Clients who had once trusted him were pulling out of projects, no longer willing to associate their investments with a man whose personal affairs had become public knowledge. His business, once thriving, was now barely holding on. Eric had no direct hand in this, he had only planted seeds. The rest had grown on its own, watered by Laura and Ethan's own miscalculations. The final blow came not from Eric, but from within Laura's own circle. A former friend, Jocelyn, an influencer who had once admired Laura's ambition, had turned on her. Whether out of genuine anger or self-preservation, she had gone public with a thinly veiled story about a woman who had built her life through deception and manipulation, only to fall victim to her own schemes. Though no names were mentioned, everyone knew who it was about. The reaction was swift. Those who had remained neutral began speaking out. Others, who had once been close to Laura, saw the tide shifting and quickly distanced themselves. The few people she had left, gone. Even Ethan didn't attempt to salvage their relationship. His own problems had consumed him, and Laura was no longer an asset, she was a liability. And just like that, she was truly alone. Eric had watched the events unfold from a distance, never interfering, never reacting. Until, one evening, Laura finally called. This time, he answered. Her voice, once sharp and controlled, was different. There was no anger, no arrogance, only exhaustion. She spoke of regrets, of mistakes, of how everything had spiraled beyond what she had intended. She had lost everything, her friends, her reputation, her security. And for the first time, she admitted that she had been wrong. Eric listened, but he felt nothing. Her words were not for him. They were for herself. He didn't offer comfort. Didn't give her the closure she sought. Instead, when she finished speaking, he simply said goodbye and ended the call. It was over. She had destroyed their life together, believing she would walk away untouched. Now, she was left with nothing but the weight of her own choices. Weeks passed, and Eric's life moved forward. His reputation at work had never been stronger. His quiet resilience in the face of everything had earned him not just respect, but admiration. He spent his free time rebuilding himself, his passions, his life. The satisfaction he felt wasn't in Laura's downfall but in the knowledge that he had refused to be the victim of her betrayal. One evening, as he sat on his back porch with a book and a quiet mind, he received a message from Jocelyn. She had shared an update. Laura had moved out of town, disappearing from the social scene entirely. Eric read the message, then put his phone away. It didn't matter anymore. Laura had been so focused on escaping a life she thought wasn't enough that she had never considered what would happen if her new one fell apart. Now, she was left with the consequences of her own ambition. Eric, on the other hand, was free. And that, in the end, was the real victory.